All the stitches that are available on your machine are displayed here on the front panel. You've got utility stitches, buttonholes, satin stitches, quilting and heirloom, decorative, all kinds of stitches to choose from. When you first turn the machine on, it goes directly to straight stitch. So while we're in straight stitch, let's take a look at how to sew a seam and how to change the stitch length settings. To sew a seam, you're going to place the raw edges of your fabric against one of the seam guidelines, depending on your project. Seam guidelines are indicated on the needle plate in metric or in imperial or inches. And you'll see fractions of inches in the back and the metric measurements in front. A really popular seam allowance for a lot of commercial patterns is 5/8 of an inch. So we'll place our fabric against the 5/8 inch seam guideline. I'm going to lower the presser foot lifter and just sew forward a couple of stitches. And then press and hold the reverse to sew backwards a few stitches. And then release it and step on the foot control again to sew forward all the way down to the end of your seam. Then when you come to the end, press and hold the reverse button, release, and sew forward again. Raise the presser foot lifter, and you can trim your threads on the thread knife at the side of the machine, and what that will do is leave your thread tails long enough so that they don't come unthreaded when you start to sew again. And there's our seam. We have our securing stitches at the beginning and end so that our seam won't come undone when we continue working on our project. We just finished sewing a seam and we use the reverse button. But here next to the reverse button is another button, and that's the programmable needle up down. To show you how that works, I'm going to work on this piece of fabric here. I'm going to put my presser foot lifter down and I'm going to sew. When I stop sewing, the needle stopped in the up position. But maybe when I stop sewing, I want it to always stop down. I can press this button, my needle will go down. It's great for pivoting and sewing around corners. So now when I stop sewing, because I've activated that button, when I stop sewing again, now the needle will stop down. I don't have to press it again. Again, great for pivoting, appliques, sewing around quilt bindings, all kinds of applications for this. Stop down again. But if I want it to stop in the up position, I will just press it again, and now every time I stop, it will be in the up position. So you have the choice, up or down. Again, great for quilt bindings, sewing around appliques. It acts a little bit like a placeholder so that as you turn a corner, you won't lose your place. So here on our machine is another set of controls. We have our LED screen, and here we have this button that has an M on it that actually means mode. And each time I press it, I'll see the LED light here above the mode button change. This is our stitch selection mode, meaning I can choose the stitch I want to sew. This allows me to change the width of my stitches, and this one allows me to change the length of my stitches, or the distance between the stitches. We just sewed a straight stitch, and the default setting was 2.5 millimeters. But if I want the stitches longer, depending on the thread I'm using or the project I'm sewing, maybe some top stitching on denim, I'm going to want to lengthen out that stitch length. And it'll go as far as 4.5 millimeters. So let's see what that looks like. Place our fabric underneath the presser foot and step on the foot control to start sewing. Trim the thread. And here you can see that the stitches are actually quite long compared to the first piece that we sewed. There's 4.5 millimeters of distance here instead of just 2.5. So again, depending on the thread you're using or the project you're sewing, you can choose anywhere you want from 4 down to 0.5 millimeters. Now if I press the mode button again, I go back to my stitch selection and I'm going to come down one more to the width setting. Now on a straight stitch, obviously there's no width on a straight stitch, but the width control can be used to change the position of the needle. Right now it says 3.5, so it's in the center, because this is a 7 millimeter stitch width on the machine, and so 3.5 would mean it's in center. I can scroll up and I can see my needle moving every time I press the button up to 7 millimeters, which would give me actually right needle position, or the far right needle position. And if I go the other direction, down to 0, that's far left needle position. 3.5, which is center for straight stitch. You would want to do that if you are inserting a zipper, maybe you're doing some edge stitching or some top stitching and you just want to move the position of the needle over a little bit. Use your width control in your straight stitch to put the needle in the position that you want for your project. Speaking of the mode button, you've probably noticed that every time I press it, there's a beeping sound. If you want to turn off the beeping functionality of your machine, you can use the mode button to do that as well. Simply press and hold the mode button until you hear it beep. And now you've silenced the beeps. If you want to turn the beep function back on, just press and hold it again until you hear the beep. And now your beeping functionality is back. Now that we've seen some things we can do with our straight stitch, let's try selecting a different stitch, and another really popular stitch is Zigzag. We're going to use our mode button to go back to stitch selection mode. And I can see here on the front panel of my machine that the Zigzag is stitch number 5. So I'm going to scroll up to stitch number 5. And if I want to see my default setting, I can press my mode button again and I can see my default width setting is 5 millimeters. So let's see what that looks like. Trim the thread tails on our thread knife. And here's our default width setting for our zigzag stitch. Now I can make this stitch wider if I want to by pressing the buttons under the LED, and this can go all the way up to 7 millimeters. And here's an example of what our default setting looks like, and here's 7 millimeter width. So you can see how the stitch changed just by changing the width. I can make it narrower too, bringing that down. This one is about a 2.0 millimeter, and it changes completely again. You can also use the stitch length control on your zigzag stitch. So here we are at the default width setting, but if I bring my stitch length really short, down to maybe about a 0.4 or 5, I can get a very dense, where there's very little fabric showing between the stitches. That means the length is smaller, and I might use this for maybe sewing around an applique or doing some decorative work. I can go the other direction and make the stitches longer or further apart. And when I bring that to as far as it will go, you can see that this is the same exact stitch, but very short stitch length or very long stitch length. So experiment with stitch length, stitch width, and even different threads to find the look you want for the project you're working on. You may have noticed at the base of your machine this white tab. When you pull the tab, it actually shows you a press-a-foot recommendation chart. All of my decorative stitches that show on the front panel of the machine have a number above them. This chart lets you know what press-a-foot you need to use for the stitch you want to sew. If I wanted to sew stitch number 38, this very satiny stitch, I would go to my mode in stitch selection mode and pick stitch number 38. Check for number 38 on my pull-out panel down here, and it's recommending presser foot A. And I can see over here presser foot A is my satin stitch foot. And the satin stitch foot is recommended for these satiny stitches. This stitch is very dense. There's a lot of thread in the stitch and it's very thick. This foot has a little groove or tunnel on the underside that lets all the dense stitches pass freely underneath. So for whatever stitch you want to sew, just pull out this tab and check your stitch by number against the tab and you'll see which presser foot to use.